this one is about theory terms because I figured after my last video that it was actually very useful to know a lot of different terms in debate because terms are what make up the bigger arguments. For example, like plans would be inherency, advantages, solvency, things like that. Those are all specific arguments that make up into a bigger argument. I feel like learning it this way just makes it a lot easier when you're hearing things or trying to understand things because you know what arguments or where the terms apply. So let's talk about a couple of things that happen in theory debate. So we'll talk about like the four parts, right? We'll have an interp, a violation, or your standards, or standards, and then voters, and then like it's not a part, but it's definitely something you have to have is the implication. So let's first talk about interp, right? So an interp is pretty easy. So I like to imagine theory like laws because they are just rules for debate, but they function the same way laws do, right? You need some kind of text for the law. So we'll talk about speeding laws. It's my favorite one for this example. You say like, we'll say debaters should not speed. Not speed read, like speed in cars. And this word, debaters, instead of people, is pretty important to how the standards play out, right? You can use more specific words like debaters, or people, or affirmative debaters, right, to make it so you can have different ways to interact in standards. But I'll get in a second. So you just need like a text for your law thing. So I chose, like we're talking about speeding, so I chose like debaters should not speed. And the violation, you obviously need to just show that they violate. So whatever the app does, right? The app is driving 60 miles an hour. So we're assuming your neg, right? App goes 60 and a 40. Right? Goes 60 and a 40 mile per hour zone. So you prove that they violate, right? So why is the violation bad? You'd have like safety, or like accident rate. So this is what it causes, is an accident rate. Like sharp increases in accident rate. Because less response time. This is an example, right? The standard is just the reason, or what it causes, and then so it could cause 100 things, right? You could walk too fast and have accidents, but you need to talk about like what makes them uniquely important, right? You could be driving too fast and use a lot of gas, but why would be using a lot of gas be less important than having more accidents, right? So that's where voters come in, right? You also need to tie in every standard to your voters. So let's make our voter first, and then we'll come back and tie it in. So I would say a good voter is like safety. So if you're talking about speeding laws, you probably care about safety because like we use regulations. We only use regulations. To stop harms. So there's no other reason have that speeding law unless it was to protect people. Right. So now I'm going to go back and tie this back to safety. So safety would be if accident rates have a sharp increase in the accident rate because there is less response time, then that's key to safety, right? Key to safety. Because you get injured when you wreck. Right? So there's the timing safety, right? But imagine this was where we stopped, right? We stopped at the voter, right? Because safety is important. But then what happens if you speed? Nothing, right? There's nothing in the text of this law or rule that says that anything will happen if you do speed, right? If you do go 60 in a 40. So that's where the implications come in, which are like drop the debater, drop the argument. So you choose which one. I would say for the most part, you re-drop the debater. But if you're against a good theory debater, it might not be a good idea because that gives them the opportunity to have that RVI debate, which is the reverse voting issue debate, which allows them to win by beating you on theory. So maybe they prove they're not violating, or they're not doing something bad, or what they're doing is actually good, or something to that degree, right? If you're not confident in your ability to debate theory, it might be better. In some instances, you can't go for drop the argument, but it might. In a lot of instances, that's a safer route. But the majority of people choose to just go for a drop the debater because it is an instant win, right? It's like a no-risk issue for you as long as you're good at that RVI debate. Okay, so we're going to say drop the debater, or drop the debater. The implication for speeding would be like lose your license. Obviously, that's not what happens. You have like a fine, but we're going to say lose your license. And you need to justify that, right? That's why we need this. We need this because then only good drivers be on the street, right? Reason one, only good drivers. Reason two, like deterrence, right? So that's like what a shell would look like. So if we wanted to do this for like debaters should not speed read, like we could literally do like go from this shell. The same format, right? It'd be like debaters should not speed read. The app speed read 60 miles per hour, you know. The standards would be like traditional education, right? It'd be like traditional education is impeded whenever debaters that aren't are on still at a traditional level can't comprehend the speed at which a debater is reading. You lose valuable information. You could say like clash round, or if you're affirmative, you could say like, oh, I read my speech really slow and they read theirs insanely fast, so they've added like 5 different barriers to me having any kind of clash, right? Because I don't have to understand the argument, I have to hear it, I have to make argument very short argumentation against like 100 different arguments, right? Because they get so much out. Things like that would all be the standards, and those would be key to like education or fairness, right? It's not fair that they're doing that, right? It's an unfair practice to have to do 100 times more arguments than they did at a slower rate because you're a slow debater. So just the fairness shifts there. Also the education you lose out on if you're not actually comprehending the arguments. So those are different things, right? And you vote on education because it's an educational activity. We come here because it's educational. Schools have debate classes because it's educational. Debate clubs, right? Fairness, the same thing, right? They don't promote non-fair activities. They wouldn't be like, yeah, let's just be unfair as hell. Let's fund that activity, things like that, right? And then drop the debater instead of get rid of licenses. You'd be like, it's good for deterrence. It makes it so that people can't abuse. I lose time having to read this, or I lose because they have abuse, right? Something like that. So those are those. Oh, I just erased the top part. Well, you all know this is theory for dummies. All right, so some other interactions, right, in theory that you probably need to know are, maybe we can go over some of the general standards. It's probably a good idea. So some of the ones I immediately think of always are reciprocity, predictability, topic lit, critical education. It's actually usually critical literature, but it can be either. And then there's phil lit, philosophical lit. There's so many more. Times cube, right? There's just so many. Literally anything you can think of that would make something seem to be not shouldn't be allowed. That's a standard, right? Alright, we'll go over these, and I'll try and think of some while I'm doing it. I don't know. I'm just kind of like blanking out. Okay, so reciprocity is something reciprocal, right? So it has an equal allotment on both sides. So when we talk about reciprocity in debate, we talk about fair for both sides, right? So an example of a reciprocal argument is that debaters, if I said only the if I said only the negative debater gets to, actually, a very good argument to explain this is AFC, right? Affirmative framework choice. It says that the affirmative debater just gets to choose the framework for the round. There's no, like negative doesn't even get a debate out of it. They just have to take what's given, right? And that is insanely unreciprocal, right? Because, so we're talking about AFC, right? Like, I put little like circles with lines through them for not reciprocal. So we should put R for reciprocal. Not reciprocal because one side is forced into like random ass positions, and it makes it insanely hard to read your own literature or like any kind of argument, right? They can literally guide what you read against them. So they could make it like the most impossible framework where only their athlinks in, and there's no way for you to win. Because one side has no choice or has no ability to engage. So that's a pretty bad standard explanation, but like it's pretty quick. So okay, and then obviously remember we'll have to add something to the end of all of these if we wanted to link them into fairness education. I feel like that one's pretty intuitive. You lose education if you can't read any arguments, right? You also, it's not fair if you could never engage in some kind of like debate, right? So pretty intuitive how those would engage. So predictability is like the ability for you to know what kind of like have like topic literature or stuff prepped against arguments. So if let's for example let's talk about the Nuclear Power Act, right? Nuclear power topic. There was an app that was read against me that was insanely unpredictable, right? Very untopical. They parametricize the resolution. This is where parametricization shells are very commonly like the counter to them is like predictability, right? You'd be like, you should not parametricize the resolution because the one she read was debaters we should ban nuclear power in space, right? And it was ridiculous. Like that is ridiculous. There was no literature for that because there are no nuclear power plants in space. And so she just talks about like one article about how this guy was talking about how eventually, like in like 2050, we'll have nuclear power in space and it'd be dangerous, stuff like that. It was insanely hard. Like there was no way for me to engage. It was ridiculous. So I read like T, right? I read Shell, and I was like, that's not predictable. There's no way to engage this app. They cherry picked one article, gave neg no responsibility, neg no topic literature ability, right? Topic lit to engage, or clash ground. Which is key to education, yada yada, right? So topic lit. So I'm going to just kind of do all of these together. Topic lit, critical lit, fill lit, right? Anything that stops you. So if the AF read a theory shell that said that you have to read plans, I could just be like, well, that means that I would read the debaters may read plans, critical arguments, or philosophical arguments, and then just like read critical lit or fill lit as my standard, and then just like those are really the counter shells, right? They also apply in various shells, right? They're not only specific to those. Just a good example. It's pretty intuitive, like what critical literature and philosophical literature and what topical literature mean. And then time skew. I feel like everyone's heard this at least once in their life. Time skew is just like 6373, like, oh, it's unfair because I have to respond in 7 minutes and 4 minutes. 6 minutes to respond to that, and I have to respond to that in 3 minutes, right? That back and forth, like who has the time advantage, who has the non-time advantage, stuff like that.